They thought they were fighting for freedom, but they soon realized they were trapped in a nightmare. In the Vietnam War, nothing was as it seemed. The jungle was a maze of death, where venomous snakes, aggressive insects, and booby traps lurked in every corner. The enemy was invisible, hiding in tunnels and blending in with the civilians. The atrocities were unspeakable, from the slaughter of innocent villagers to the mutilation of corpses, and the survivors were scarred for life by the horrors they witnessed and the poison they breathed. This is the story of the Vietnam War, the most terrifying war in history. The Vietnam War was a brutal conflict that claimed millions of lives and left deep scars on both sides. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the war was the jungle warfare, where the enemy was often invisible and the dangers were everywhere. The first U.S. Army deployment in Da Nang in 1965 marked the beginning of a long and bloody struggle in the dense jungles of Vietnam. The U.S. soldiers were not prepared for the harsh terrain, the tropical diseases, the booby traps, and the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. They soon realized that they were fighting a war that they could not win. More than the jungle, the most terrifying aspect of the Vietnam War was the guerrilla tactics used by the Viet Cong. They were everywhere and nowhere. They could disguise themselves as peasants, merchants, or even allies, and strike without warning. They used booby traps, mines, ambushes, and hit-and-run attacks to inflict heavy casualties and demoralize the American soldiers. They knew the terrain, the weather, and the people better than their enemies. They were relentless, ruthless, and fanatical. The horror reached its peak in 1968 when the Viet Cong launched a massive surprise attack during the Tet holiday, the Vietnamese New Year. They targeted major cities, military bases, and even the U.S. Embassy. Although the Tet Offensive was a military failure for the Viet Cong, they gained psychological victory. It shattered the illusion of American superiority and exposed the futility of the war. The Vietnam War was not only a war of guns and bombs, but also a war of minds and spirits. The U.S. Army, in an attempt to demoralize and frighten the Viet Cong, used a psychological warfare tactic called Operation Wandering Soul. They broadcasted fake recordings of the voices of dead Vietnamese soldiers who claimed to be the ghosts of the jungle. The recordings were eerie and haunting, with sounds of moaning, crying, and begging. They appealed to the Viet Cong to surrender, to stop fighting, and to return to their families. The recordings were based on the Vietnamese belief in ancestor worship and the afterlife. According to this belief, the souls of the dead needed proper burial and rituals to find peace and harmony. Otherwise, they would wander the earth as restless spirits, suffering and causing misfortune. The U.S. Army hoped that the recordings would exploit this fear and superstition and make the Viet Cong lose their will and morale. The Vietnam War was a brutal and dehumanizing war, where some American soldiers lost their sense of morality, compassion, and humanity. They became killers who committed atrocities against the Viet Cong and the civilians. They tortured and mutilated their enemies and collected their body parts as war trophies. They cut off the ears of dead Viet Cong and strung them together into necklaces. They wore them around their necks or traded them for beer and cigarettes. They posed with them for photographs, smiling and laughing. The brutality of American soldiers was fully showcased in an event known as the My Lai Massacre. On March 16, 1968, a unit of American soldiers from the Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, led by Lieutenant William Calley, entered the village of My Lai in South Vietnam. They were on a search and destroy mission authorized by their commander, General William Westmoreland. They were supposed to find and eliminate the Viet Cong, who were believed to be hiding in the area. Instead, they found and killed hundreds of unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly. They showed no mercy, no compassion, no humanity. They shot, stabbed, burned, and raped the villagers who pleaded for their lives and tried to escape. They threw grenades into houses, wells, and ditches where people sought shelter. They mutilated and tortured the bodies and took photographs as trophies. The American troops left behind a scene of horror and devastation, a scene that would haunt the world for decades. It is estimated that 500 civilians were massacred by the U.S. troops at My Lai. Another most terrifying aspect of the Vietnam War was the underground war. The Viet Cong had built a vast network of tunnels throughout the country. The tunnels were the lifeline of the guerrillas, where they stored weapons, supplies, and command posts. They were also the death traps for the invaders, who faced booby traps, snakes, rats, spiders, and the enemy's guns and grenades. To counter this threat, the US and Australian forces recruited brave soldiers who volunteered to enter the dark and claustrophobic underground mazes. They were called tunnel rats, and they had one of the most dangerous and difficult jobs in the war. Armed only with a pistol, a flashlight, and a knife, they had to crawl, squeeze, and fight their way through the narrow passages. They had to rely on their senses, their instincts, and their courage. The tunnel rats faced unimaginable horrors in their perilous missions. They had to confront the enemy in their hidden lairs, often in hand-to-hand combat. They had to deal with the constant fear of being buried alive, blown up, or captured. They had to endure the physical and psychological toll of living in a constant state of stress and terror. Once inside the tunnel, you never knew what was around the next bend. You never knew if you were going to make it out alive. You never knew if you were going to see your buddies again. It was hell. There are also hidden victims rarely mentioned. They were the forgotten ones, the children of the dust. They were the offspring of American soldiers and Vietnamese women who were often prostitutes, rape victims, or lovers. They faced discrimination, abuse, and poverty in a society that rejected them. They were called names such as Bui Doi, which means dust of life. They were denied education, healthcare, and citizenship. They were shunned by their families, their communities, and their countries. Some of them had a chance to escape their misery when the US government launched Operation Baby Lift in 1975. However, the operation was not without tragedy. On April 4, 1975, a C-5A Galaxy transporting 243 children crashed shortly after takeoff, killing 153 people, including 78 children. Fortunately, subsequent missions were successful, bringing in more than 2,000 children to US soil. The Vietnam War was a horror that lasted long after the last bullet was fired. The American soldiers who returned home faced a hostile and divided society. Many suffered from PTSD. Some were called war criminals and baby killers by anti-war protesters. The veterans felt betrayed by their government and abandoned by their country. However, their fate was nowhere near as dire as that of the South Vietnamese who stayed behind. The victorious Viet Cong persecuted and abused anyone who was suspected of collaborating with the Americans. They confiscated their lands, imprisoned them in brutal camps, or executed them. And the Amerasian children, the offspring of American soldiers and Vietnamese women, faced discrimination and rejection in both lands. Even in America, they had trouble integrating. They were often called half-bred dogs and looked down upon by both whites and Asians. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. See you next time.